We've seen that movie. Yep. Yep, that's it.
I'm pretty good.
One more.
Maybe one more.
Ah.
Oh, I love it.
That was nice.
That's pretty good. Do you think that's centrifugal?
I should be alright.
The 2022 Bauer Studio project is an open-sided pavilion intended for use as a cultural learning space and general gathering point for the community at Cummeragunja, a small township on Yorta Yorta land on the banks of the Murray River in New South Wales. The pavilion has been constructed by several groups of University of Melbourne students over the last 18 months, following consultations with community leaders that began in 2019. Early in discussions about the project, there was an interest from the community in finding a way to use red gum thinnings which had been accumulated from the bush surrounding the Cummeragunja township. These thinnings became the primary structural elements of the pavilion, the forest-like columns and beams. By integrating the red gum into the pavilion as a key material, it helps to ground it as part of the landscape and contributes to creating a space that's appropriate for use as a site for cultural learning. By nature of these design choices, however, the untreated timber columns and beams are constantly exposed to weathering, moisture, and other environmental factors which inevitably shortens the lifespan of the structure and will require some level of intermittent intervention if it's to remain in place beyond a 20-year period or so. This limitation imposed by the material begs the question of how the pavilion can continue to be useful beyond the lifespan of its timber components. To help answer this question, a link can be drawn with a ritualized construction process that occurs every 20 years in the Mie prefecture of Japan at the Ise Grand Shrine, one of the most significant sites for the Shinto religion. The compound, which dates back to the 3rd century, is a sprawling configuration of over 100 buildings, which house ancient religious artifacts and draw millions of pilgrims and tourists every year. Two of the largest and most sacred buildings in the complex, the inner shrine and the outer shrine, are the subject of a ritual known as Shikinen Sengu. Every 20 years, for well over 1,000 years, the two buildings have been dismantled and then reconstructed in their entirety on an adjacent plot. Not only does this process teach philosophical lessons relevant to the Shinto religion, promoting ideas of transience and renewal, but it also creates the opportunity for ancient carpentry techniques to be practiced continually, keeping traditional methods of construction and architectural design alive as practical skills in ongoing generations. The ritual is important because it acknowledges ancestral knowledge while simultaneously recognizing the importance of providing practical skills for future generations in order to maintain it. As the pavilion now stands on the bank of the Murray River, it's now realized in what can be understood in this context as its first iteration. Using some of the same ideas practiced as part of the Shikinen Sengu ritual in Japan, there's a possibility for the pavilion to behave as an ongoing space for education and learning, not only in cultural practice, but also in construction methods, architectural design, and in creating built spaces which both make use of and contribute to their surroundings. As time goes on, by nature of the kit of parts from which it's derived, a kit which reflects both the design languages which have been practiced and iterated on throughout Bauer Studio's previous projects around Australia, and the community aspirations for the space, the pavilion design has a capacity for renewal or reiteration embedded in the outcome. Also embedded in the outcome is an ease of constructability. The project is simple to construct by its nature because part of the intention was buildability by unskilled labour. In this first instance, specifically by University of Melbourne Masters students and local high school students participating through the ACT program. This construction process can be broken down into 3 primary stages: column fabrication, fitting the columns to the footings, and assembling the roof. The timber columns can be fabricated on the ground from the red gum logs. Once the logs have been cut to the correct length for each footing and stripped of any bark, they can be made by cutting slots at each end to house the steel components, pre-drilling and prepping for the bolts to fix these components, and then fitting the top connecting bracket to one end by bolting and strapping it into place. The columns can then be attached to the concrete footings by lifting them up onto the steel plate cast into the footing in teams and running bolts through the assembly to fasten them there. After strapping the lower connection and bracing the columns, the beams, each made from 2 lengths of the red gum thinnings, can be cut for length and also to create a joint at the centre of the beam between the 2 pieces of timber. These can be lifted into the steel top connections, bolted together in place, and fastened to the columns with coach screws. Once these are in place and secure, brackets can then be fitted onto the beams to house the 8-metre purlins made from steel angle. After lifting, levelling, and fitting the purlins to the brackets with Tek screws, the perforated steel roofing, made from alternating lengths of weld-lock steel, can also be lifted up onto the roof and fixed in place. The process is simple, and its requirement of only a limited palette of materials, tools, and skills which can all be taught whilst it's being built. Moving forward, there's a possibility for the pavilion to continue as a teaching device in design and construction. By accepting the transience of its materiality as part of the architecture, it can be understood as functioning on a cycle, responding to time as well as place in ways that are differently beneficial throughout the stages of their enactment. The scales of time with which it interacts, cycles of daylight, seasons, and the cycles of eventual rebuilding after a number of decades also relate back to the environment, the landscape, and their links to Cummeragunja and its residents. The sense of transience and of architecture derived from place has the capacity to interact with the pavilion's function as a cultural space and space for teaching and learning. The links to country and to Cummeragunja's unique identity embedded in the architecture and formulated out of prompts from community leaders can, for example, provide opportunities for emphasising or illustrating verbal storytelling, as well as a space for it to take place in. The motifs which are cast into the concrete footings of the pavilion refer to aspects of the landscape that were highlighted by the community for inclusion in the final designs. In the sides of the seating, there are representations of fish scales, riverbank erosion, sand dunes, weatherboard housing, and river reeds. These abstracted forms reference Cummeragunja's history, the Murray River, and its importance to the community. By choosing to abstract physical elements of the landscape into the architecture, rather than directly interpreting stories into architectural forms, they avoid imposing Western preconceptions or ideas about Cummeragunja's identity and Yorta Yorta culture onto the architecture. Rather than attempting to tell stories themselves through formal gestures, the references to landscape act as prompts to help facilitate storytelling by people in the community. Because the conversation on what could be included was led by the community, these prompts hold significance largely as references to a local understanding and lived experience of place, rather than existing as broad-stroke constructions of culture that are easily consumed by outside or Western audiences. This feeds into the idea of placemaking through occupation and use, the possibility for a relationship to place that develops over time through use and association rather than as something pre-established. Different aspects of the pavilion also hold different places within various timescales, which create an interconnected network of time-based elements that can be read from the architecture and its materiality. Whilst the forest of timber columns contributes to the lengthier narrative of renewal, shorter spans of time are emphasised by other elements present in the pavilion. In particular, the perforated steel roof interacts with cycles of daylight, mapping out daily and seasonal changes by creating patterns which dynamically interact with the timber members, steel components, and ground surface in particular ways. The patterns cast by the sun through the roof map the passing of time over the physical elements on the pavilion, creating a layer of texture and movement that contributes to how the pavilion sits both with itself and its surroundings. How the pavilion can be used at different times of day is also affected by this, with the changes in the shade it provides, and even the appearance of that shade. The reciprocal benefit from rebuilding the structure creates a dynamic relationship between the building and the community that is ongoing and both contributes to and has the capacity to eventually transcend Bauer's growing relationship with Cummeragunja. The importance of Cummeragunja, its history, and its resonance to the building itself is embedded in the pavilion through representation and integration of ideas and motifs that link the pavilion to a Cummeragunja identity. And through continued learning through and in the space, there's hopefully room for these links to evolve or broaden moving forward.